This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.
The Science Notes podcast on OAR FM Dunedin, brought to you by the Division of Sciences at the University of Otago. I'm Dave McMorrin. Over the next half hour, I'll be chatting with a graduate science student about their research, their passion for science, and the things that fuel their creativity. Well, hello there, and welcome to another episode of Science Notes. My name's Dave McMorrin, and this time our guest is Lily Heidmann. Heidmann.
Yeah.
Welcome, Lily.
Thank you for having me.
On what would have to be called a rather rubbish day in Dunedin.
Yeah, a bit gross, but we're here anyway.
We're wet, but we're here. But as we said, coming up, you're a marine scientist, so you don't mind being wet.
No,
that's
not
all good.
at all.
So Lily's doing a
Masters.
That's right, I didn't know that. A Masters in Marine Science at Otago University. And so we're going to talk a bit about what she's been doing for her Masters work. But before we get into it, how was it that you find yourself doing a Masters?
Well, it's kind of a long story. I've always wanted to do marine science. Mm-hmm. I grew up going to Golden Bay every
nice.
year.
So you're from up that way?
No, I'm from North Canterbury, but that was like our little wee holiday spot.
Yes, nice.
Loved the ocean.
Yep.
Adored it. And I was like, I could do something animal related. I'll do vet. And then I was like, putting down animals, maybe not. So I was like, marine science kind of sounds interesting. So I kind of stumbled into it. I did my undergraduate here.
Yep.
So a Bachelor of Science with Marine Science and Ecology. And then I was umming and ahhing, and I was like, well, why not? Not quite burnt out enough yet, so let's go again. And had a meeting with my supervisors, Chris and Anna, and I was like, I want to do salmon. Salmon's interesting.
Yep.
And then Anna was like, I have this project. Do you want it? And it was with kingfish and Asparagopsis, the seaweed I work on. And I was like, why not?
Yep.
And lo and behold, I'm here doing seaweed and absolutely loving it.
I remember years ago, we had someone on the show who did salmon.
Mm-hmm.
And they were measuring the age of the salmon by counting the rings on the otoliths and the ear bones, which you can do.
Yeah.
And so they were given all the salmon, they had to take out the ear bones, and they got the rest to keep.
Oh, so much
Which
salmon.
seemed like quite a good project. Yeah. So not quite that for you.
Not quite that for me. It kind of steered more into the seaweed kind of things,
right.
which I wasn't expecting, but ultimately I love doing
I think when kids are growing up thinking about marine science, they're thinking of dolphins and stuff. They're not thinking of seaweed.
And totally. And that's what I started my undergrad with.
Right.
And then I did an aquafy field trip down south and to the salmon farms, and that's where the salmon came from.
Right.
And then transitioned on, and now we're here.
So, seaweed.
Seaweed.
Why seaweed?
Well, it's one of our ecosystem engineers. So it's a lot of benefits to our ocean. It helps break down carbon. It helps kind of protect our biodiversity and the health of our ecosystems. And it's just, you can actually eat it.
Yeah.
So there's also that for humans. But it's just all around something that our oceans need.
I suppose it's a bit like a forest is an important.
It's a really good.
Is important in and of itself, but it's also important for all the things that live under the trees and in the trees and around the trees.
Exactly.
So
same thing with
it's the same
seaweed.
thing, yeah. Except you can't really see the seaweed the same. You can't see what it's doing because it's all under the ocean.
Exactly.
So, in particular, you were interested in Asparagopsis.
Asparagopsis armata.
I've been practicing, right?
Good on you.
So what does Asparagopsis look like if you bumped into some on the way home?
So it has several forms. So it has the gametophytes, which are long branches that have kind of tiny little hooks on the end, and it's red.
Right.
The form I work on are called tetrasporophytes, which are tiny little pom-poms that can float up in our oceans.
Right. Are these things that we might have seen at the beach?
Gametophytes, yes, probably not tetrasporophytes.
Okay. Those are little wee round things that you can pop and
little
stuff.
Pom-poms,
Yep.
yeah. Like in the kit when you were a kid and you got all the rainbow-coloured little wee pom-poms? Kind of like that.
Sure. And then the third type is
a charosporophyte, which is similar to the gametophyte.
Right. Okay.
Morphology.
And you're particularly interested in this one because?
So tetrasporophytes have a larger surface area to volume ratio. So it helps us understand nutrients either easier in uptake because of that large surface area.
Right, so larger surface area, more options for nutrients to be absorbed,
Exactly.
more nutrients in them, easier to measure.
Exactly.
Sure. And have people done research on this particular seaweed before?
Yep. So Asparagopsis taxiformis is there's 7 different taxonomic types.
Right.
3 that are kind of used. Taxiformis and Amata are found in New Zealand. Amata's native to southern Australia and New Zealand, but is actually invasive in the Europe and Mediterranean,
Right.
which is very interesting.
So it's over there as well.
It's over there as well. It's kind of worldwide. Yeah, I forgot your question. Sorry, I got distracted talking about different types.
So why that one?
It was just the one I had access to.
Right.
Really.
Okay. Sure. Yep. So it's not endemic. It's not native to New Zealand.
It is native to New Zealand.
Right. Your one is native to New
Yeah.
Zealand. Cool. So that's always interesting then, because it could be a bit different, and if it's useful, that's interesting.
Exactly. Yeah.
So to study it, do you have to go to really weird parts of the world, or do you just have to go off the beach in Dunedin? Or
So to start with, I work in collaboration with CH4 Global, the methane reducing startup company.
right,
And so I did a lot of my research with them in Northland,
right.
and then managed to get some seaweed down in Dunedin and did a bit of research down here. So that's kind of how I got access to it.
Is it easily accessible, or do you have to? Does it live quite shallow in the ocean or deep, or?
I'm not quite sure. I only really see the gametophytes in the ocean. The
Right.
tetrasporophytes are kind of cultured.
Okay, sure. So
Yeah.
you don't have to get them you don't have to jump on boats and.
No, I get horribly seasick. So me and boats, despite being a marine scientist, are not actually friends.
Sure. Good. So then you've just kind of alluded to this, but why then the particular interest in this particular seaweed?
Right. So Asparagopsis has what we call bromoform. So bromoform is a compound, an anti-methagenic compound, that reduces and inhibits the methane production in ruminant animals.
Right.
Yeah.
So for context then, this is the whole issue about how livestock, and in particular I think cows
Yeah.
in New Zealand and everywhere, but it's a big deal
Predominantly
in New Zealand,
yeah.
release a lot of methane, which is a greenhouse gas.
Exactly. Commonly burps and farts.
Indeed. Yes.
Slightly inappropriate, but yes. And interesting, I can't even speak today. In New Zealand, agricultural methane emissions makes up about 37.5% of our total greenhouse gas budget. So
Right.
it's a significant portion.
So that's like including the cars and the
Including
trucks
the
and all that
cars
sort of stuff. Yeah, it's still a
Exactly.
third,
Yeah.
which is to do with how many cows we've got, I suppose.
And our big export industries and
Yeah.
all that.
Yeah. So it's kind of a big deal.
Slightly a
And
big deal.
and the methane comes about from the little bit of reading I've done, just as a byproduct of the way that the cows it's a byproduct of how the cows digest the grass, but then the products of that getting turned into methane by microbes that live in the cows' stomachs.
Yes.
Right.
Exactly.
So the idea is to try and find a way for that process to be inhibited,
Exactly.
and the bromoform in the seaweed does that somehow.
Exactly.
Do we know how?
Something to do with different compounds and H2, hydrogen, and something in there just inhibits it. I'm not sure directly.
Yep.
But
This chemistry's not
chemistry's
what you're
not
focused
my
on.
strong point.
And doesn't have to be for what you're doing.
No.
So the idea is then that this compound that's in this particular seaweed, if you fed the seaweed to the cow, the compound would somehow inactivate what these microbes are doing and reduce how much methane's being released.
Exactly.
And so this has been shown to be a thing
Yes.
in New Zealand.
I'm not sure in New Zealand. I think in Australia it's predominantly
Right.
shown. But it's up to 90%, so it's pretty significant what
Yeah.
the seaweed can do.
Yep. And of course, because the methane's not really anything to do with what the cow needs, it's going to have no effect on the cow,
Yeah.
assuming that the bromoform and the seaweed itself doesn't do things to the cow. But I think from the reading I did in that paper, I mentioned there's no evidence that it does.
Yeah. Not currently. I mean,
Yeah.
stuff is coming out all the time. But
Yep.
as far we know.
Yep.
No.
So that's good.
It's positive.
So then we potentially have a way to reduce the amount of methane that the cows are burping and farting.
Yeah.
But then, and I think this is where kind of you're particularly interested in, that then implies that we need to have a way to sustainably produce the seaweed.
Exactly.
And so this is where we cycle back to the whole salmon farm thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
So tell us about that.
So for my research, I actually used kingfish effluent. And I took kingfish effluent off Niwa farms.
Right.
And diluted it to have a range from unsupplemented to about 100% kingfish effluent.
Right.
And I ran a 3-week trial with seaweed, with replicates, to see whether or not different inclusions of kingfish effluent, so from a 0 to 100%, would have an effect and be able to grow the seaweed from using that effluent.
Right. So in effect, you're using the effluent as a fertiliser for the seaweed.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the question is, does it work? And then if it works, how much do you need?
Yeah.
So the effluent itself, so the kingfish farm, so this is a commercial farm.
Mm-hmm.
You just sit down south somewhere, you said?
No, up in Bream Bay.
Oh, which is?
Northland.
Bream Bay, Northland.
Yeah.
See, North Island, I'm a bit ignorant of that.
That's okay, me too. I'm from the South Island.
It's too warm for me. Okay, so they farm it commercially up there.
Yeah.
And so this effluent is just kind of in the water around where the farm...
So they use what's called a recirculating system, an RES system. So
Right.
they basically... Fish poop.
Yep.
Lovely, great. And then they take it through, like, I don't know the entire process, but it's something like removing solids, biofilters, and then recirculating it back into the farm so that it's, like, reusable for the fish. So I was kind of interested in taking it off that recirculating farm and whether or not you could, like, foreseeably feed the effluent into the seaweed, into that whole system and make it like a waste product from something, could help solve the waste product of something else.
Yeah, so you could effectively set up a plantation of seaweed next door to the fish farm.
Yeah.
And everyone wins.
Everyone wins.
So, what did we find?
We found that it did kind of work. 100% effluent is a little bit hard on the seaweed.
Too nasty, yes.
Too nasty, a little bit too much nutrients. Your sweet spot's kind of about 30%.
Right.
So 30% effluent to 70% seawater, you see lots of growth, pretty good bromoform, and it's kind of what you want for your seaweed.
So how do you measure the bromoform content?
We use an electrospectrometer, some fancy machine name that, like, you use methanol and it draws the bromoform out.
Right. Would it be an electrospray mass spectrometer?
Probably that.
There you are.
Some really long term.
That's a thing I know at least, and that could be right. Right. So you kind of do the standard chemistry thing where you milkshake up your bit of seaweed, extract things out, feed them into machine, and the machine tells you how much is there.
Pretty much.
And so how much bromoform is there in a typical sample of your seaweed? I mean, what counts as a good number?
It depends, really. You could have anything from 0 to 50.
Parts per million or megs per...
Megs per something.
Kilogram.
Megs per gram.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Something. Yeah. So you could have anything.
Right.
Mine kind of fit between the like 5 to maybe like the 30.
And is the amount of bromoform that you find related to the levels of fertiliser that you're feeding them?
Yeah, definitely.
So the more fertiliser, the more bromoform?
Actually the opposite.
Right. That's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
So that becomes an issue then, doesn't it? Because not wanting to rain on your entire masters, but the more if you've got to feed plants, but the more you feed them, the less of this you have. But
that's why that 30% is a sweet spot.
Right. Okay. Cool. Sure.
Because you're still getting, say, the good bromoform levels, but you're also getting that growth. Because growth is really hard at that 80 to 100% because there's so much nutrients that the seaweed's like, I'm going to panic.
Yep.
So that's kind of that sweet spot that we kind of like, where there's that balance between you getting that growth, but you're also still getting that high level of bromoform.
So then you set up your plantation of seaweed next to your fish farm, ideally. You feed it appropriate diluted effluent that goes through. And then what is the process of getting the seaweed from there to the cows?
So that process I can't really speak to because I wasn't really
a
part of it.
Yeah.
But I assume drying and just
grinding it up.
Yeah.
In. And so I think you said that this hasn't been tested in New Zealand. Is the plan to, in the future, go ahead and try this on cows here?
Honestly, I don't know.
Right. That's outside of the scope
That's outside of what I... Because I'm more like the nutrients. The nutrients is kind of it's where my research is. So looking at the nutrients from the effluent, and then I also have a second experiment that looks at like the small scale. So whether how Asparagopsis takes it up in like 3 hours.
Right.
Nutrients. Mm-hmm. And I've taken from the kingfish effluent experiment, because that's what I ended up doing first. I was going to do the other way around, but it ended up with timing and everything and masters and you know how it is.
Yep.
So taking ammonium nitrate and urea, which are kind of the key things you find in fish effluent and recirculating systems, and measuring it on a smaller scale to see what the seaweed does when it's exposed to it over a 3-hour time span.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's just an exercise then in having a bit of seaweed, exposing it, and then taking it out and doing the same extraction.
Same kind of thing. Didn't really measure bromofauna on it. It
Right.
was more focused on the nutrient and uptake rates and seeing how, particularly urea, because not a lot, hardly anything has been done on Asparagopsis and urea uptake with time depletion experiments. So kind of seeing that and whether or not it uptakes the same as ammonium and nitrate or does it do something different because it's a different chemical and compound. Yeah.
And not one that potentially it would normally see as much, is it? Because urea is a common fertiliser that you would apply on a farm. Mm-hmm. And these days, unfortunately, some of that often gets its way into rivers and then out into the ocean. Yeah. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's getting to where the Asparagopsis is.
Exactly, yeah.
So how does it react when it sees this new thing?
Exactly, and especially with finfish waste.
Yeah.
And if that's going to be a sustainable fertiliser for Asparagopsis, we kind of know how ammonium and nitrate reacts, but how does urea react? And that's what I'm kind of still working on figuring out, but getting there.
So is that both in terms of, I suppose another question. So the seaweed you're studying it over 3 hours. I'm formulating this as we go.
Let's go.
How long would a particular plant be growing before it was harvested and used? Because I suppose the question then is how long, over what time period of exposure of it to a chemical like urea, which it's not used to, might it be okay with until suddenly something weird happened?
Well, it's kind of what we're still testing. For the kingfish, I call them my kingfish experiment, my uptake experiment, to kind of determine them. For my kingfish experiment, it kind of did okay. And those were long-term, like 3 to 4 days.
Right.
For the uptake, which is 3 hours, which is definitely different time scale, it definitely uptook it. And when exposed to all 3 at once, it still kind of liked it.
Right.
But it's still trying to figure out to what extent compared to, say, ammonium and nitrate does it like.
Sure.
Yeah.
So how far through are you in your master? You're second year now?
Second year. I'm hoping to finish end of this year.
Yeah. So you're well into like the data analysis type aspect of it. So if you had to summarise what you found.
Well, like we talked about, that kind of 30%.
Sure, yep.
That's what we found from the kingfish effluent.
Yep.
From the uptake, we kind of found that similar to other papers in the past, Asparagopsis kind of does a surge uptake. So initially at 5 minutes, like any other nutrient, same with ammonium and urea, it uptakes really quickly.
Yep.
And with nitrate, what's really interesting is about 60 to 90 minutes, it shows another huge uptake, which is very interesting.
But only with nitrate.
Whereas ammonium is kind of gradual, and urea kind of does a big down with its surge uptake and then kind of trottles along in between the ammonium and nitrate. Yeah.
So it's almost like initially everything's just being absorbed just because it's being absorbed. But then after some period of time, the plant's actually going, hang on, let's do something different now to specifically get more nitrate.
Yeah. So it was kind of interesting.
Is that a phenomenon that's known?
A little
things?
bit.
Yeah.
A little bit. A paper back in 1987 by Thomas and Harrison found that with a couple other seaweeds.
Right.
But it's something, initial data analysis kind of thing. So I'm still kind of working my way through and figuring out why.
Yeah.
And I guess that's what my discussion's for eventually.
Yes, because that would imply maybe that the seaweed needs to have more nitrate than the others. And that might in turn influence how you set up your nutrient mix for them.
Yeah. Yes, maybe you change your effluent. Don't know. Still kind of in that kind of grind at the moment.
Do you think this idea of setting up your seaweed plantation beside the fish farm, would that apply to other types of fish?
Yes.
Is the effluent kind of the same regardless?
From what I understand, it's kind of similar.
Right.
I mean, it depends what system, like whether you're open ocean, like cage farms,
sure.
or you're on land and kingfish and recirculating. Kind of depends, but I would say it's pretty similar.
Right. So it's applicable. If it turns out to be a good thing, then it's applicable to all
applicable
sorts.
for other species.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, and there's been a bit of stuff done in the literature with seaweed and effluent and stuff, but not heaps with Asparagopsis in New Zealand. Yeah,
cool. And because it's a local one, then it's an interesting and a good one to study.
Exactly.
Cool.
Yeah.
So, finishing the masters this year.
Finishing the masters this year.
And then?
Writing bursary, hoping to publish a couple of papers, as probably everyone says. But then I'm actually going travelling.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to go teach at Camp Canada.
Oh, nice.
Next year, and maybe do some solo travelling and just see the world a little bit. I've been here for 5 years, so I think it's about time to spread my wings
and you can now.
Have a little adventure.
Yeah. You got a Vancouver t-shirt on. Are you off to Vancouver or?
My family lives there,
right. It's a lovely place.
Shout out Canadians from Vancouver.
Yeah, lovely place. We went there. Actually, the weather was very similar when we were there to what it is outside today. It was awful weather, but it's a nice place. So.
Yeah, it's gorgeous. I love around the islands and stuff,
Yeah.
Hornby Island in particular, and being around there. But yeah, definitely visiting my family overseas and seeing where the world takes me pretty much.
Yeah, so maybe a PhD, more research down the track? Or
Potentially. Something that my parents love to tease me about. Thanks, Mum and Dad. But potentially, it depends.
Yeah.
I would be totally open to coming back and doing IMTA stuff, the integrated multitrophic stuff that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
But seaweed's now my new passion.
Yeah.
So thanks, Anna, for that one.
So I suppose you go away. You give it a year or so, and if the itch is there,
then I'll come
then
back
you come
and
back,
see how I'll do. But for the moment, I think the travel itch needs to be a little bit scratched.
Sure.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you for coming in and talking to us a bit about what you've been up to.
Oh, awesome. Well, thank you for having me.
No, you're very welcome. And thank you, everyone out there, for listening. You've been listening to the Science Notes podcast, brought to you by the Division of Sciences at the University of Otago. To listen again, or to find other episodes in this series, go to Otago Access Radio's website, oar.org.nz, or to your favourite podcast platform.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.